Today marks exactly 100 days since the formation of the Government of National Unity. There's been mixed reaction as to how the union of 10 parties has performed. Let's now speak to the University of South Africa Professor of Political Science, Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time this evening. When we look, for example, at the handling of the KZN government of this snowstorm that would have taken place this past weekend, I quickly scanned just to see, for example, what the opposition had to say. I mean, had it been not the government of national unity, I'm sure the opposition would have had many things to say about how the government was handling this situation. But strangely enough, there was none whatsoever. Is that an indication of some kind of cohesion that is beginning to take place? Or are they still applying a watch and wait kind of approach?
No, I think, good evening, I think those parties that were now for the first time in the Government of National Unity, and it's the majority of them, but very specifically the DA and the IFP and others, that they, I think, have now taken co-responsibility. The way in which they are functioning in these 100 days now are clearly an indication that they believe that they have a very important role to play, that they have immediately assumed their positions. They are not standing back to a wait and see type of attitude. They are in some instances actually quite assertive. And I think what we have seen now, in some cases, actually surprisingly becoming very much involved. I would give you one example, which I was very much surprised about, is how Minister John Steenhuisen, the Minister of Agriculture, attended the FOCAC conference in Beijing as the minister and became involved in the signing agreements with the Chinese and being very positive about it. While in the past, the DA as political party was always relatively reserved about the government's relationship with China. So that's just one indication. And then let's say the more problematic issues, and specifically the Bello Act, as well as the National Health Insurance, and then some of the foreign policy matters, they are present, and to some extent they have been confronted but especially in the case of the Bello Act, but it did not lead to a fragmentation or a split away or a standing apart. Type of a fist fight between the different parties. So for now, it looks as if they have said, well, we don't have an option. We have to cooperate in the best interest of everyone.
Has President Cyril Ramaphosa managed to, for lack of a better word, exert his authority on all the ministers that report to him, including those that come from across the table?
Again, it looks like it. I couldn't pick up any indication that there's sort of, let's say, competition between President Ramaphosa on the one hand and the leaders of the different political parties, that they have to compete to whom are the ministers actually responsible and accountable. I think all the main political party leaders have accepted that their members are accountable to President Ramaphosa as the president. And so far, the way in which it is functioning, I think that it's working relatively well. What we don't know is what is the relationship between these ministers and the ministers in the office of the president, because they play also a very important role, but they are all ANC ministers or coming from the ANC. And I think this is where one should look very carefully at how do they relate specifically to the other ministers in the cabinet.
We are, of course, still to really see the full impact of the GNU in terms of the long-standing infrastructure delivery challenges in the country. But we've got, for example, a minister there in that space of infrastructure that is representing the Democratic Alliance. Are we beginning to see a move in terms of policy implementation as far as that department is concerned?
Well, I don't think we are seeing the direct consequences of changes in infrastructure. That's something that obviously is a more longer term type of horizon that one will have to take into account. Infrastructure is not built in a few days. Uh, what we are seeing is, I think, but that started already before the election. For example, the improvement with respect to some of the ports like Durban and Cape Town, changes with respect to railway lines and the use of that, and the changes that were made in Prasa and in the Prasa leaders, and sorry, in, Transnet and the leadership in there, even in the case of Prasa with the metro lines. So in that sense, yes, we are seeing a difference, but it's I won't say it is necessarily because of the government of national unity. Some of them are for longer in the pipeline already. What we are seeing also is that with respect to electricity, that's a major change. And I think when one looks at the economic situation in South Africa, it's possibly the most important change that has happened. Again, I would say it's not specifically because of the government of national unity. Many of these things have been in the pipeline, but I think it serves a good purpose for creating a positive atmosphere, a positive sentiment, optimism that are directly associated with the government of national unity.
Yeah. Speaking of that positive sentiment that is created, the Democratic Alliance leaders have had to at least review and I believe, if I'm to be corrected, withdraw two of their appointments. I know definitely one was given the leeway to say, well, I've said you must resign. I mean, others would have said the thing that John Steenhuisen would have just said there was that I am revoking this appointment, you are no longer appointed. But what does that say in how the DA would have handled those two appointments that sought to be quite controversial?
Yes, I think this is something which is, I would say, it's still part of the birth pains of the government of national unity. Although many of the decision makings, the functioning of the government of national unity are going relatively well at this point in time. I think there's going to be situations like this where there's going to be difficulties and differences of opinion about more operational or decision making matters. Um, and the way in which individual ministers will function in that respect. And in the end, obviously, everything comes back to President Ramaphosa. He is, according to the Constitution, solely responsible for the executive. In some instances, he does it together with ministers, but he takes final responsibility. So all the main and sometimes controversial decisions that are made by the ministers in the end must receive the green light from President Ramaphosa. So I think this is in future will possibly see a repetition of some of these controversial matters, and then it will be a test whether President Ramaphosa will be able to put down his foot in terms of his own position and that of I would say the majority of the cabinet. But again, it is something, what has happened now, which I think is very important, very significant, is that I think it was last weekend, there was a meeting of all the party leaders who are present in the government of national unity on the cabinet. They've come to an agreement, amongst other things, about a mechanism how to deal with disputes within the cabinet. And that has been announced now. The details I haven't seen yet, but it is very important that that type of mechanism is established within the cabinet, and that will filter down, I guess, to other levels also. But with such a mechanism in place, I think it will be able to avoid controversial situations to expand and become issues that will sort of hinder the functioning of the cabinet or the government of national unity. So we are still, this is now after 100 days, but still in a relatively early stage of the development of the government of national unity with respect to procedures, internal procedures, but also policies. And I think in terms of policies, we will still see a lot of development and sometimes maybe even controversies that will develop. The other point, which I don't know if we're going to discuss it, but is also the impact that it has on the other spheres of government. And I'm here in Swani, and it looks like it does have now an impact on what is possibly going to happen in this coming week with respect to a possible motion of no confidence here. So there's all sorts of implications. None of them, or most of them, so far, being, I think, relatively optimistic, and that the public in general are feeling that the arrangement so far is working.
Yeah. Let's talk about the performance again of some of them before we look ahead at some possible future areas of conflict. But the Home Affairs Department, I mean, after the Infrastructure Department having to deal with extortions and whatnot, the Home Affairs Department seems to be one of those that has really been busy in the last 100 days with a whole lot of issues that that particular department has had to handle. How did the minister, I suppose, represent himself there?
Well, I think, first of all, the DA ministers in general are quite good in terms of communicating what they are doing. And that includes Dr. Leon Schreiber, the Minister of Home Affairs, but also the other ministers. And I think that's a very important component of the function of the minister, is to tell the public and obviously Parliament of what they are doing. I think what he had, although he was actually not the spokesperson of the DA before the election for Home Affairs, but he was more involved in public administration, is that he immediately sort of got to grips with some of the main issues of Home Affairs. Given the fact that it is so controversial for many parties, the way in which the government dealt with incoming foreigners, with immigrants, with illegal immigrants, with persons who just walk over the borders of South Africa, it is one of the big issues. And for him to be able to demonstrate a sense of that he understands the issues and want to do something about it. For example, one of the main announcements he made is to change the whole way in which the department operates in order to digitize, to put online, and in the same way, therefore, to try to avoid the human contact and the human influence of decision making, and thereby trying to avoid corruption. I think that made the impact. It's not yet implemented, but at least we know in which direction he is thinking. And that in itself is already very important, because it shows that there is a solution in the pipeline. At the same time, some of the ANC ministers are doing the same thing. The Minister of Police, Senzo Mchunu, clearly has adopted a completely different approach. It's much more data-based. It's much more based on making an analysis of what is happening in terms of crime and crime statistics and patterns of crime, and responding to that directly. So again, it creates much more confidence or trust in the way in which the government is functioning now than before the election.
So, following, of course, a little bit of tension around the Minister of Basic Education, whether she showed up at the signing of the Bella Bill, now the Act, the leader of the party, then John Steenhuisen, was speaking, I think, at one of the press conferences. He spoke of an indication of making some proposals to the finance ministry, particularly around fiscal discipline and consolidation and cost cutting. Do you see that as a future point of conflict in terms of those proposals that the Democratic Alliance might want to put to the ANC, who've got COSATU on this one side, and the teachers and public servants wanting particular bargaining council agreements fulfilled and honored?
Well, the fiscal situation is, at the moment and for the foreseeable future, is going to be one of the main headaches of the government, of how to manage that, how to reduce the level of debt, public debt, sovereign debt, how to implement a more restrained form of financial management situation of government, but at the same time not jeopardize the work that they want to do. I think that is the biggest challenge, is that there's huge expectations of what the government is supposed to do. but they have limited resources, especially financial resources for that. And how to balance that act is something which is going to affect all the parties. Even the parties who are more in favor of much more of a restraint or discipline in the fiscal situation or in the fiscal management at the same time understand that there are some serious pressing demands, public expectations that must be met. So that balancing act, I think, is something which is going to require a lot of negotiations within the Government of National Unity. Now, if we look specifically at the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance, then one of the deputy ministers comes from the DA, a very, I would say, talented young person who is one of the deputy ministers together with the minister Enoch Godongwana. And I think they will establish or form quite a strong team. And the fact that the DA is so close to the decision making through the deputy minister, I think will give them a sense of that they are co-responsible for this decision making and are not bystanders or standing on the outside with respect to this. So I can see that in the end they will come to a point of working together because at the same time the other institutions, like for example SARS, has become very effective as well as the Reserve Bank is still maintains its independence. And that combination of institutions, I think, is creating quite an effective team at the moment.
Let's talk then about the smaller parties. I mean, within the GNU, you've got the UDM, you've got the PAC also making a showing. But we've also got other smaller parties that have been operating within the committees, for example, of SCOPA and the public service accounts. How have they asserted themselves in those positions?
Well, I think if we look at the real small parties, for example, the UDM, General Unisa is now the Deputy Minister of Defense. I happened to meet him at an event. He looks very enthusiastic about his role. He believes that as a former general, he has a very important role to play there. So I think he feels that this is not just an appointment in order to accommodate the UDM. It's certainly something that he can do there. If we look at some of the committees, for example, Drazim Zamzi's leader is now the chairperson of SCOPA, the Select Committee on Public Accounts in Parliament. It's a very possibly one of the most important committees of Parliament because they can, well, all the departments must report to them on their financial reports, the Auditor General reports. So it's a key committee in Parliament. And the fact that that he is appointed in that position, traditionally, it's the chairperson is always coming from an opposition party, gives them the opportunity to play that role, even if they are a very small party in Parliament. I think that the parties that are to a large extent in the shadows or the cold are the EFF and MK, and now also Action SA, which is very much in the news at the moment. And they don't play that type of active role. They are still more in the case of opposition parties. But the IFP have two very important ministers. They deal with the state institutions, COCTA, as well as with public administration. It's very important from a public point of view and from a government point of view. So I would say, although they are maybe not so prominent, they are clearly in key positions in the cabinet, and I think the IFP therefore feels that they are received recognition for the role that they've played over many years in Parliament and in South African politics.
Let's talk a little bit more about the opposition. I mean, MK has had a rough start, I suppose, within the party itself to console itself, to get the right members in place. There was infighting within the party itself, taken to court and so on and so forth. Don't you think that they are now in a much more solid footing with the type of people that they've brought in there, and they are going to now begin to have a more meaningful participation in that parliament?
Well, I think MK still has to go through a process of just becoming acquainted with with Parliament. Parliament is not an easy institution to understand, and its workings and its procedures and the traditions that exist there, and how to exert your influence in Parliament in the most effective way. That, for example, it requires that you have very effective whips, the chief whip as well as the whips for each of the portfolio and other committees there. It's how to organize the parliamentary caucus there in order to function effectively. I, in the beginning, thought before these changes happened with Floyd Shivambu and others that the EFF will possibly be asked to assist them, just to acquaint them with the procedures and the functioning of Parliament. As I said, it's not something, if you have never been in Parliament, it takes time to develop that expertise, that understanding, that experience of how to be an effective parliamentarian. And the majority of, well, almost all the members of MK have no parliamentary experience. And that includes the parliamentary leader, Dr. Sloppy. So I think it will take time for them in order to become really effective in the parliamentary proceedings.
Yeah, I'll tell you there's one or two there that would have been in Parliament before, maybe in the ANC, chairing a committee there, and maybe also in the EFF. So not necessarily all, but I suppose the majority of them are certainly new to the environment of Parliament. The EFF challenges, do you think they are over those now?
Well, that's difficult to say. It's difficult to look into the crystal ball about this. From an EFF point of view, hopefully yes. But we will have to see. Maybe at the level of public representatives, it might not be any major changes still again. But one doesn't know what's happening on the ground. The EFF is going to have their conference in December, their elective conference. So I guess one will start to see the preparations for that, and then what happens at the conference itself. We know that there's lots of campaigning for the different positions within the top structure of the EFF. So that is certainly going to be very informative for all of us to see what will be the outcome of it and whether there will be a change, and therefore also that it will take the party in a different way. The mere presence of the MK party has become a major challenge for the EFF. They've lost in the election, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, a lot of their support to MK. And therefore, although they have to work together now, they are actually also competing against each other. We will have to see whether there is a growth in other provinces over and above the three where MK established themselves during the time of the election, and whether that will mean that the EFF is going to lose. It's very difficult to predict that at this point in time.
Right.
But it is the move of Floyd Shivambu and some other senior persons away from the EFF to MK is certainly a setback for them.